The Texas sun bled into the horizon, a molten orb painting the plains in shades of fire and shadow. Dust swirled in the restless evening breeze, biting at Jack Thornton's weathered face as he guided his chestnut mare, Daisy, along the northern fence of his sprawling cattle ranch. At 38, Jack bore the scars of a hard life, lines carved deep around his eyes, a jaw set like iron against the relentless wind, his hands rough as rawhide from years of roping steers and hammering fence posts, gripped the reins with a quiet, unyielding strength. It was 1876, and the Texas frontier was a powder keg. Rustlers prowled the shadows, bleeding honest men dry, while tales of Apache war parties spread like wildfire through the saloons. From Abilene to San Antonio, every creak of a saddle, every gust across the plains, carried the promise of trouble. Jack's ranch was his empire, wrested from the unforgiving earth after the war left him with nothing but a battered rifle and a stubborn dream. Every splintered corral, every blade of grass coaxed from the cracked soil, was a testament to his grit. He'd poured his soul into this land, building it into a haven for his herd and the handful of men who worked it. But lately the ranch felt cursed. Rustlers had hit twice in a month, slipping through the night to steal his cattle, and his hired hands whispered of Apache raids, their fear as thick as the dust clouds that choked the horizon. Jack's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the endless expanse, catching every flicker of movement, every shadow that didn't belong. He'd learned long ago that survival meant seeing trouble before it saw you. As Daisy crested a low hill, a cry pierced the stillness, a raw, desperate wail that stopped her dead, her ears twitching. Jack's blood ran cold, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt revolver at his hip. The sound came again, weaker now, fraying at the edges like a thread about to snap. He swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching on the parched ground, and followed the cry to a shallow gully choked with mesquite and tumbleweed. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that felt like the world holding its breath. Jack pushed through the thorny brush, his heart steady but quick, every nerve alert for an ambush. He'd seen men die for less than a moment's kindness in these parts, yet something in that cry tugged at him. A hook sunk deep in his chest. There, sprawled in the dirt, was a boy no older than 12. His dark hair matted with blood and dust, his buckskin shirt, fringed and adorned with beads that caught the fading light, marked him as Apache. His leg was twisted at a grotesque angle, bone pressing against skin, and his chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths. His eyes, wide with pain and fear, locked onto Jack's, and for a moment, the vast plains shrank to just the two of them, a rancher and a stranger, bound by a fragile thread of fate. The boy's lips moved, muttering words in a tongue Jack couldn't understand, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Who did this to you, kid?" Jack's voice was low, steady, but it carried the weight of a man who'd buried friends unseen. Betrayal in every form. He crouched beside the boy, his eyes darting to the gully's edges, half expecting shadows to spring to life. The plains stretched silent, but the hairs on his neck stood up, prickling with the sense of being watched. He tore a strip from his own shirt, the fabric ripping loud in the quiet, and began binding the boy's leg with careful, practiced hands. He'd patched up wounds before, his own, his men's, even a calf caught in barbed wire, but this felt different, heavier. "Hold still," he said, his voice softer now, almost a murmur. "You're gonna be all right, you hear me?" The boy flinched at his touch, his eyes searching Jack's face for something, mercy, perhaps, or the glint of a knife. Jack didn't know, didn't have time to guess. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandage, and the boy's breath hitched, his small frame trembling like a leaf in a storm. Jack finished the splint, his fingers steady despite the questions clawing at his mind. Was this kid bait for a trap, a scout for a raiding party, or just a lost soul caught in a world that chewed up the innocent? He stood, hoisting the boy onto Daisy's saddle, his weight so light it stirred something in Jack's chest, a memory of his younger sister, long gone, her laughter silenced by fever years ago. As he swung up behind the boy, cradling him against his chest, a shadow flickered on the ridge above. A lone Apache warrior stood there, tall and still, his bow slung across his back, his silhouette carved sharp against the last gasp of daylight. Jack's hand twitched toward his revolver, his pulse a steady drumbeat. The warrior's gaze bored into him, unreadable, heavy as a storm cloud rolling in. For a heartbeat, Jack thought he saw the man's hand shift, but no arrow came, no sound. Broke the silence. Then the warrior was gone, melting into the twilight like a ghost. Jack spurred Daisy toward the ranch house, the boy's warmth a quiet weight against him, the plains stretching vast and unforgiving around them. The lantern light of home glowed faintly in the distance, a beacon in the growing dark, but Jack's mind churned. What had he just done? Saved a life, or invited death to his door? That warrior, why had he held back? The answers lay somewhere in the dawn, and Jack knew they'd come with a price. The wind howled low, carrying the scent of dust and danger, and as the ranch house drew nearer, one thought burned clear. Whatever he'd started tonight, there was no turning back. The first light of dawn crept over the Texas plains, painting the ranch in hues of gold and gray. Jack Thornton hadn't slept. The Apache boy, now lying on a cot in the ranch house's spare room, stirred fitfully, his fevered murmurs filling the quiet. Jack sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the horizon where the warrior had vanished last night. The air felt thick, like the calm before a storm, and the distant lowing of his cattle did little to ease the knot in his gut. His foreman, Caleb, a weary man with a quick temper and a quicker draw, paced the porch outside, muttering about bad omens. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the dawn would bring more than sunlight. As the sky brightened, a low rumble broke. The stillness hoof beats, steady and deliberate, coming from the east. Jack stood, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards, and stepped onto the porch. A line of Apache warriors emerged from the haze, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. There were at least a dozen, mounted on lean ponies, their faces painted with streaks of ochre and black. At their head rode a man with a presence that commanded the air, a tall figure with broad shoulders, his dark eyes fixed on the ranch house. Jack's hand rested on his revolver, but he kept his stance open, his heart pounding like a war drum. Caleb hissed from the corner of the porch, his hand already on his pistol. "Told you, Jack. You brought this on us, taking in that kid." Jack shot him a look, sharp enough to silence him, but Caleb's words gnawed at him. The other hand's 3 men, loyal but green, gathered behind, their rifles ready, but their faces pale. Jack raised a hand, signaling them to hold. He stepped forward, alone. As the lead warrior dismounted and approached, his stride steady, his bow slung across his back. "I am Cale," the warrior said, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of authority. "The boy, Tarak, is my son. You have him." "Why?" His eyes, piercing and unyielding, studied Jack like a hawk sizing up prey. Jack met his gaze, unflinching, though the weight of a dozen warriors at his back made his skin prickle. "He was hurt," Jack said plainly, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "Found him in a gully, leg broken, bleeding bad. I brought him here to patch him up. He's inside, resting." Kel's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in his eyes, doubt, maybe, or a grudging respect. He gestured, and two warriors dismounted, moving toward the house. Jack tensed but stepped aside, letting them pass. The boy's safety was his only leverage, and he wasn't about to lose it to a fight he couldn't win. Inside, the warriors knelt by Tarak, speaking softly in their tongue. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and when he saw his father, a weak smile broke through his pain. Kel's stern face softened for a moment, a father's relief betraying his warrior's mask. He turned to Jack, his voice quieter now. "He says you bound his wounds. Why risk this for one not your own?" Jack shrugged, the weight of the question settling heavy. Didn't seem right to leave him to die. The truth was simpler than he could explain. A flicker of his sister's face, her laughter gone too soon, had pushed his hand. Cale studied him, then nodded, as if weighing a debt. "You have my son's life," Cale said. "But my people are hunted, and your town fears us. They will come for you if we stay." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "We will guard your land from the thieves who steal your cattle. In return, you keep Tarak safe until he can ride." Jack's jaw tightened. A pact with the Apache was a gamble, protection from rustlers, but a target on his back from the town. Caleb's scowl burned from the porch, and Jack could feel the hands unease like a weight in the air. But the rustlers had bled him dry, and the boy's life hung in the balance. "Deal," Jack said, extending his hand. Cale didn't take it, only nodded, his gaze unreadable. As the warriors set up camp at the edge of the ranch, their presence a quiet threat against the open plain, Caleb pulled Jack aside, his voice low and sharp. "You're playin' with fire, Jack. The town hears you're sittin' with Apaches. They'll burn this place to the ground, and I ain't dyin' for your damn fool heart." Jack met his eyes, seeing the fear beneath the anger, and wondered if Caleb's loyalty was as thin as the dust under their boots. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the sense that this pact born of one act of mercy might cost more than Jack could pay. The moon hung low over the Texas plains, a pale sliver casting jagged shadows across Jack Thornton's ranch. The night was restless, the air thick with the scent of sage, and the distant lowing of cattle. Jack stood on the porch, his rifle cradled. In his arms, the weight of the Apache Pact heavy on his mind. Cale and his warriors had settled in a makeshift camp at the ranch's edge, their silhouettes flickering against the firelight like ghosts in the dark. Tarak, the injured boy, slept fitfully inside, his fever breaking, but his legs still too weak to bear weight. Jack's hired hands, 3 young men barely out of boyhood, kept their distance, their whispers sharp with unease. Caleb, his foreman, hadn't spoken since the pact was struck, his silence louder than any curse. Jack's eyes scanned the horizon, where the plains stretched endless and unforgiving. The rustlers would come again, he could feel it, like a storm brewing in his bones. They'd grown bolder, striking under cover of night, and Jack's herd was dwindling faster than he could afford. Kel's promise of protection was a lifeline, but it came with a shadow. The town's hatred for the Apache ran deep, and Jack's choice to harbor them was a spark in a dry field. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the quiet. To quiet. A sharp whistle cut through the night, high and urgent, Kel's signal from the camp. Jack's pulse quickened as he grabbed his hat and sprinted toward the corral, where the cattle stirred in a restless mass. Shadows moved in the distance, low and swift, like wolves circling prey. The rustlers. Jack signaled his hands, who scrambled to their posts, rifles glinting in the moonlight. Cale and his warriors materialized from the darkness, their movements silent, their faces painted for war. Kel's eyes met Jack's, a wordless agreement passing between them. The pack would be tested tonight. The rustlers hit hard, a dozen men on horseback charging from the western ridge, their shouts tearing through the night. Gunfire erupted, sharp and chaotic. As bullets whizzed past Jack's head, he dove behind a water trough, returning fire, his shots steady, but his heart pounding. The cattle stampeded, their hooves shaking the earth, and in the chaos, Jack caught sight of the rustlers' leader, a hulking figure named Vance, his face scarred and unmistakable, a man who'd carved his name in blood across the frontier. Vance's men drove the herd toward a break in the fence, their plan clear: scatter the cattle and vanish into the night. Kel's warriors moved like shadows, their arrows silent and deadly, cutting down rustlers before they could react. One of Jack's hands, a kid named Tommy, screamed as a bullet grazed his arm, but he kept firing, his face pale but resolute. Jack shouted orders, trying to hold the line, but the rustlers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Then, from the ranch house, a small figure stumbled out, Tarak, dragging himself on a crutch, his eyes wide with determination. "The gully," he rasped, pointing west. "They'll drive the cattle their narrow path, easy to trap." Jack hesitated, the boy's words a gamble in the heat of battle, but Tarak's gaze was steady, his knowledge of the land born of a life on these plains. Jack nodded to Cale, who barked orders in his tongue. Half the warriors broke off, circling wide to cut off the gully. Jack and Cale fought side by side, their shots and arrows a desperate rhythm against the rustlers' onslaught. A rustler charged Jack, his knife gleaming, but Kel's arrow found the man's chest before he could strike. Jack nodded his thanks, the moment forging a fragile trust between them. The tide turned as Kel's warriors sealed the gully, trapping the rustlers in a choke point. Vance roared in frustration, his men falling under the combined force of Jack's hands and the Apache. The remaining rustlers fled, leaving a trail of dust and blood. As the gunfire faded, Jack caught his breath, his hands trembling with the adrenaline of survival. Cale stood beside him, wiping blood from a shallow cut on his arm, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp with respect. But the victory was short-lived. Caleb, who'd hung back during the fight, stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "This ain't right, Jack," he spat, his voice low enough that only Jack could hear. "You're sitting with savages over your own kind. I'll hear about this." Jack's gut twisted. Caleb's words a blade sharper than any rustler's knife. He'd seen the fear in Caleb's eyes all night, but now it looked like something darker, something that could burn the ranch to ash. As Kel's warriors gathered their wounded and the cattle settled, Jack knew the real fight was just beginning. The plains stretched silent around them, but the dawn promised more than peace, it promised judgment. The morning sun climbed over the Texas plains, its light harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows from the ranch's battered corral. Jack Thornton stood in the yard, his boots caked with dust and blood from the night's battle. The air still carried the acrid tang of gunpowder, and the low moans of wounded cattle mingled with the distant murmurs of Kel's warriors, tending their own. Tarak, propped on a crate near the porch, watched the horizon with eyes too old for his 12 years, his leg bound tight but his spirit unbowed. The rustlers' attack had been repelled, but the victory felt hollow, like a breath held too long. Jack's hands clenched at his sides, Caleb's whispered threat echoing in his mind. "The town will hear about this." As if summoned by the thought, a cloud of dust rose in the distance, accompanied by the rumble of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. Jack's heart sank. He knew that sound Abilene's townsfolk, riled up and righteous, coming to settle a score. Caleb stood at the edge of the yard, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, his hand resting on his pistol. Jack shot him a look, sharp and searching, but Caleb turned away, his silence louder than any confession. The hands Tommy, still nursing, his grazed arm, and the others gathered nervously, their rifles half raised, unsure who the real enemy was now. The townsfolk arrived in a motley wave, a dozen men on horseback, some with shotguns, others with pitchforks, led by Amos Reed, the town's self-appointed moral compass, his beard gray as the steel in his eyes. Behind them, a wagon carried a few women, their faces pinched with fear and judgment. Amos reined in his horse, his voice booming across the yard. "Jack Thornton, you've gone and lost your damn mind. Harboring Apaches, led an encamp on your land like it's a damn powwow. You're a traitor to your own kind." Jack stepped forward, his hands raised but his voice steady as stone. "Ain't no treason here, Amos. I saved a boy, that's all. Those Apaches fought off rustlers last night, saved my herd, maybe my life. You'd do well to think before you start swinging accusations." The crowd muttered, some nodding, others spitting into the dirt. Cale stood at the edge of his camp, his warriors poised but silent, their presence a spark in a dry field. Jack felt the weight of their gazes, Apache and townsfolk alike, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Amos's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on his reins. "That boy's one of them, Jack. You think savages care about your herd? They'll slit your throat soon as you turn your back. And Caleb here says you're macking deals with them." The crowd surged forward, their anger a living thing, fed by years of fear and half-told stories. Jack's gaze flicked to Caleb, whose jaw twitched but held firm, his betrayal laid bare. Jack's stomach churned, but he kept his face hard, unyielding. "Caleb's got his own reasons," Jack said, loud enough for all to hear. "But let's talk truth. That boy, Tarak, was hurt bad, caught in a trap set by Vance's rustlers, not his own people. I patched him up, and his father, Cale, offered to guard my land in return. They kept their word last night. Can you say the same, Amos? Come here with a mob instead of questions." The crowd faltered, some faces softening, but Amos wasn't swayed. "Words don't change facts, Thornton. You're sitting with killers. Hand over the boy and send those Apaches packing, or we'll do it ourselves." A few men raised their weapons, and Jack's hands itched for his revolver, but he held still, knowing one spark could ignite a massacre. Cale stepped forward, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much blood. "You call us killers," he said, his English clipped but clear. "But your kind took my wife, burned our camp, left my son to die in a trap meant for wolves. Jack Thornton gave him life when you would have given him death. Judge him for that, if you dare." The crowd stilled, Kell's words a mirror to their own guilt. Jack saw it, then a flicker of pain in Kell's eyes, a loss that echoed his own. The memory of his sister's fevered face as she slipped away years ago. Jack seized the moment, his voice rising. "We've all lost something. Out here, land, kin, peace. But this ain't about vengeance, it's about what's right. Kell's people fought for this ranch, same as my men. You want to burn that down. You're no better than the rustlers." The crowd wavered, some lowering their weapons. But Amos's face twisted with rage, his hand inching toward his shotgun. Before the spark could catch, Tarak hobbled forward, his crutch digging into the dirt. "I saw the men who hurt me," he said, his voice small but fierce. "Not my people. White men, with a scar-faced leader. They wanted the cattle, and they didn't care who bled for it." The crowd murmured, doubt creeping in, but Amos spat. Unyielding, lies from a savage pup, he growled, raising his gun. Jack stepped between Amos and Tarak, his hand on his revolver now, his heart a steady drumbeat. "You pull that trigger, Amos, and you'll answer for more than just today." The plains held their breath, the sun climbing higher, and Jack knew. The line between peace and bloodshed was thinner than the dust under their feet. Caleb's eyes darted, his hand still on his pistol, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the real threat wasn't the mob or even the Apaches but the man he'd called friend. The Texas sun burned high, its glare merciless on the standoff in Jack Thornton's yard. The townsfolk, led by Amos Reed, stood poised with rifles and pitchforks, their faces taut with fear and fury. Cale and his Apache warriors flanked the ranch's edge, their bows and knives ready, a silent promise of retaliation. Tarak, the boy, stood defiant on his crutch, his small frame a spark in the powder keg of tension. Jack's hand hovered near his revolver, his eyes locked on Amos, but his mind churned with Caleb's betrayal, his foreman's whispered threat, and shifty glances now a poison seeping through the morning. The plains stretched silent around them, the air thick with the weight of what came next. "You've got one chance, Thornton," Amos barked, his shotgun steady. "Send those Apaches off and hand over the boy, or we'll tear this place apart." The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs rising like a storm. Jack's heart pounded, but his voice stayed calm, cutting through the heat. "You're aiming at the wrong enemy, Amos. Those rustlers." Tarak saw him clear. Scar-faced Vance and his men set the trap that hurt him. "Not the Apaches. You want justice, ride after them, not my guests," Amos sneered. But doubt flickered in some of the townsfolk's eyes. A woman in the wagon, her bonnet askew, clutched her shawl and whispered to her neighbor. Jack pressed the advantage. "Kells, people fought for this ranch last night. Saved my herd, my men. You burn this place down. You're spitting on that." Cale stood motionless, his gaze steady on Amos, but his warriors shifted, ready to act. The moment hung fragile, a single move away from blood. Then, a sharp clatter broke the silence. Tarak's crutch hit the dirt as he stumbled forward, his eyes wide with alarm. "I heard him," the boy shouted, pointing at Caleb, who stood at the yard's edge, his face pale. "Last night, in the barn he spoke to a man, said he'd make sure the rustlers got through." The words landed like a thunderclap. Jack's blood ran cold, his eyes snapping to Caleb, whose hand twitched toward his pistol, his jaw tight. With panic, "Caleb," Jack's voice was low, dangerous, each syllable a blade. "What's the boy talking about?" The crowd turned, their anger shifting, uncertain. Caleb laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in the air. "Kids fevered, talkin' nonsense. You gonna believe an Apache over me?" But his eyes darted, and Jack saw it, the guilt. Rotten naked, in the man he'd trusted for years. Tarak's voice shook but held firm. "I heard you. You told the man with the scar to hit the west fence at midnight. Said you'd make sure Jack was distracted." The crowd gasped, and Amos's shotgun wavered, his glare turning to Caleb. Jack stepped closer, his hand steady on his revolver, his voice a growl. "You sold me out. My ranch, my men to Vance. Caleb's mask shattered. He drew his pistol. But Jack was faster, his own gun clearing leather in a heartbeat. "Don't," Jack warned. The barrel aimed at Caleb's chest. The foreman froze. His eyes wild, trapped. "It wasn't personal, Jack," he spat, voice cracking. "Vance paid good money. Said he'd split the herd. Let me take the ranch once you were broke. You were too damn stubborn to see it comin'." The revelation hit like a bullet. Jack's mind reeled every rustler hit, every stolen head of cattle, orchestrated by the man he'd called friend. The townsfolk murmured, their weapons lowering, their anger turning inward. Amos, red-faced, barked, "You lying snake, Caleb. You brought this trouble on us all." Before Caleb could answer, hoofbeats thundered from the West Vance and his rustlers, seizing the chaos to strike again. Jack spun, shouting orders. "Cale, west flank. They're combing for the herd." Cale nodded, his warriors moving like shadows, their arrows already knocked. The townsfolk hesitated, then rallied, their fear of Apaches overshadowed by the truth of Caleb's betrayal. Jack grabbed Caleb's collar, wrenching the pistol from his hand and shoving him to the ground. "You stay put," he growled, as Tommy and the hands tied Caleb's wrists. The rustlers charged. Vance at the lead, his scarred face twisted with rage. Gunfire erupted, and the yard became a battlefield. Apaches and townsfolk fighting side by side, an uneasy alliance born of necessity. Jack dove behind a wagon, his shots steady, while Kel's arrows found their marks with lethal precision. Tarak, crawling to safety, shouted warnings about the rustlers' movements, his voice cutting through the chaos. A bullet grazed Jack's shoulder, pain flaring hot, but he kept firing, his eyes locked on Vance. The scar-faced outlaw aimed for Cale, but Jack tackled him. The two men crashing into the dirt in a tangle of fists and fury. The fight was brutal, raw, each blow fueled by betrayal and survival. As the dust swirled, Jack pinned Vance, his revolver pressed to the rustler's chest. "This ends now," he growled, his finger tight on the trigger. The plains roared with the chaos of battle, and Jack knew the dawn would decide who stood and who fell. The Texas plains trembled under the chaos of battle. Dust swirled through the dawn light, thick with gun smoke and the stench of blood. Jack Thornton pinned Vance in the dirt, his revolver pressed against the rustler's scarred chest, his shoulder burning from the graze of a bullet. Around him, the ranch yard was a storm of violence. Kel's Apache warriors loosed arrows with deadly precision, their movements fluid against the clumsy charge of Vance's men. The townsfolk, once a mob against Jack, now fought alongside. The Apaches, their rifles blazing in a desperate stand to protect the ranch. Caleb, bound and kneeling near the corral, watched with wild eyes, his betrayal laid bare for all to see. Jack's breath came hard, his fist tight around Vance's collar. "You bled my ranch for profit," he growled, his voice raw with fury. Vance's scarred face twisted into a sneer, but before he could spit a reply, Kel's shadow fell over them. The Apache leader's knife gleamed in the dawn light, his eyes burning with a father's vengeance. "This man trapped my son," Cale said, his voice cold as stone. "His life is mine." Jack hesitated, the weight of justice heavy in his hand. Vance had torn his world apart, his herd, his trust, his peace, but Kel's loss ran deeper. A wound Jack could only imagine. He lowered his gun, stepping back. "He's yours," Jack said, his voice steady despite the pain throbbing in his shoulder. Cale nodded, a silent understanding passing between them, and his warriors dragged Vance away, his shouts swallowed by the fading gunfire. The battle dwindled as the last rustlers fled or fell, their horses scattering into the plains. The townsfolk, battered and bloodied, lowered their weapons, their faces a mix of shame and exhaustion. Amos Reed, his gray beard streaked with dust, approached Jack, his shotgun hanging limp. "We was wrong, Thornton," he muttered, his voice gruff but honest. "Caleb fooled us all, stirring up hate for nothing. You and those Apaches you saved more than your ranch today." Jack nodded, too weary to speak, his eyes on Caleb, who sat slumped, his head bowed under the weight of his own ruin. Tarak hobbled forward, his crutch digging into the dirt, his young face fierce with pride. Cale knelt beside him, his hand gentle on his son's shoulder. "You are strong, Tarak," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth Jack hadn't heard before. "You honored our people today." Tarak's eyes shone, and he glanced at Jack, a shy nod of thanks passing between them. Jack felt a pang, the memory of his sister's smile flickering in the boy's face, a reminder of why he'd risked everything. As the Apache warriors prepared to leave, Cale approached Jack, his presence as commanding as ever. "You kept your word," Cale said, his eyes steady. "Few men do." He extended a hand, and Jack took it, their grip firm, a bond forged in blood and trust. The Apaches mounted their ponies, Tarak riding with his father, and vanished into the plains, their silhouettes fading into the morning mist. The townsfolk dispersed, some offering quiet apologies, others silent with guilt. Jack stood alone in the yard, the weight of the fight settling into his bones. He turned to Caleb, now guarded by Tommy and the hands. "You'll face a judge," Jack said, his voice flat but heavy with finality. "And you'll answer for every head of cattle, every drop of blood." Caleb's eyes met his, hollow with defeat. But Jack felt no pity, only the cold clarity of justice. As the townsfolk led Caleb away, Jack looked out over his ranch, the corral scarred but standing, the plains stretching vast and unbroken. He'd lost much trust, blood, nearly his home, but he'd gained something too, a fleeting glimpse of kinship across a divide, a truth worth fighting for. The sun rose higher, bathing the ranch in golden light, and Jack knew the plains would carry this story long after the dust settled. In the 1870s, the frontier was a battleground of fear and mistrust, but men like Jack and Cale proved that honor could bridge even the deepest chasms. Their pact, born of a single act of mercy, had rewritten the rules of a harsh land. If only for a moment, as the ranch settled into quiet, Jack's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the Apaches had vanished. He'd never see them again, but their strength, their loyalty, would stay with him, a lesson carved into the earth. If you like this tale of justice and unlikely alliances, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of the Wild West where courage and heart shaped the frontier. What would you do to protect a stranger's life in a land ruled by fear? Share your thoughts below.